Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So in this video, we are going to talk about how it is that the de-dollarization is a myth that doesn't exist. And I know a lot of people are going to hear that and they're going to roll their eyes and shake their head and talk about how it is that the BRICS nations are setting up an international monetary system to use their own sovereign currencies to do that international trade and avoid using the dollar altogether. Now, this is very common that you hear out there, but what you don't hear a lot about is how much dollar-denominated debt exists out there, especially when it comes to these BRICS nations. Now, Brazil, for example, the B inside of the BRICS, has issued out over $15 billion worth of dollar-denominated debt that is due over the next 10 years. I believe they did this last year. I'll leave a link down in the description to the article that talks about it. And now when we think about it, this doesn't have anything to do with the United States. It doesn't have anything to do with our banks, our government, our corporations, the people here. This has nothing to do with anything to do with the United States, except that they are writing out debts that are due in these US dollars. And again, this is something that I think a lot of people, when they think about the BRICS nations or what it is that's happening with the BRICS nations, they believe that they are getting out of the dollar altogether, like they are not using the dollar, they are avoiding the dollar and not taking on any more business using the dollar, and that is simply not true. Now, I'm going to take you back a little bit. This is an article November 1st of 2022, dollar funding stresses in China. Now, this is just, specifically talking about China, but it's something similar that has taken place with many nations across the globe. Has this to say: the need for U.S. dollar funding during the financial stresses in mid-March of 2020 as the COVID pandemic news shocked markets was evident in a number of countries. Notably, however, China's dollar liquidity needs received little attention. Given China's significant economic and financial linkages to the United States and the rest of the world, financial instability there could have implications for the global economy. Hence, it is useful to develop a deeper understanding of the dollar liquidity needs of Chinese banks and non-financial corporations, and to probe whether existing avenues of dollar funding for banks and other firms in China are sufficient in times of stress. This is our objective. And now, if you go through this paper, it's quite long, so I don't have time to read it all to you. But if you go through this paper, you're going to find that there is an insane amount of debt that has been issued out not only by China, but through many nations, many corporations, many people across the globe that is due in dollars. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with the United States. The United States had done something very similar. These are called offshore bonds. And the United States had done something similar to this back in, I think, the late 70s during the Carter administration. They had issued out U.S. Treasury bonds that were due in francs, Swiss francs, and German marks. And that was because they got a better rate by issuing out these bonds in these foreign currencies as opposed to the U.S. dollar, because everybody was very scared of the U.S. dollar at the time. And so these were called Carter bonds. And again, they were U.S. treasuries that were due in a foreign currency. And other nations do this. This isn't something new or, unheard of. This paper goes on to say this: the extent of China's dollar-denominated debt. Heavy global reliance on dollar-denominated debt has been a phenomenon for some time. Non-U.S. banks commonly issue short-term dollar liabilities and did so even before the run-up of the global financial crisis. Many non-financial firms in foreign countries also finance their activities in dollars. The dollar liabilities of non-U.S. banks have now surpassed their 2007 level, as shown in this figure, and they got a graph down here, reproduced by the IMF. It goes on to say, the IMF point to increased extent of dollar borrowing by foreign entities, including non-U.S. banks, non-bank financial institutions, and operating companies. So again, this is the entities. These foreign entities include non-U.S. banks, right? These are banks that don't have anything to do with the United States. Non-bank financial institutions, so this is like the shadow banking system essentially, and operating companies. These are the corporations out there. All of them, right, have issued out debts that are due in dollars. Goes on, the outstanding quantity of dollar-denominated international debt securities and cross-border loans is 26% of global GDP and is 50% of outstanding debt securities in all currencies. So all the debts that are written around the world, right, and all the different currencies that are available to write debts in, 50% of them are done in dollars. And again, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the United States. These are non-U.S. banks, non-banking financial institutions, and operating companies of foreign entities that are all doing this. Right? Factors that support global reliance on the dollar funding include complementary between dollar trade invoicing and dollar as a safe haven, a preference among global investors for dollar-denominated fixed income assets, and an independent central bank, the Federal Reserve. So all these banks, all these people out there, they all like this dollar-denominated debt. And there is a lot of it out there. Goes on to say, China's dollar-denominated debt is primarily issued by its banks, corporations, local government financing vehicles, the LGFVs. The latter two categories are often lumped together, CCGFs in 2020. Before providing a rough sense of the magnitude of dollar borrowing by Chinese entities, we emphasize that the incompleteness of the available data. For example, the currency denomination of debt issued by Chinese entities is often not reported or is reported inconsistently. Maturity information is typically difficult to find. So they don't even really know to what extent that this dollar-denominated debt truly exists in the world is. So when you hear people saying, oh man, they're getting out of the dollar, they don't need the dollar, they're not going to use the dollar anymore, that is simply not true. It is just not true. Goes on to say this, the Chinese banking system is the largest in the world with total assets in Q1 of 2021 of about 330 trillion renminbi, RMB, or about 325% of GDP, which is also high by global standards. Although much of the domestic activities of Chinese banks are denominated in renminbi, the largest banks are highly active abroad and rely most heavily on US dollars for their foreign borrowing and lending. Banks dominate the Chinese financial system, holding over 2/3 of its assets. They are highly interconnected with other parts of Chinese financial system and the real economy. Goes on to say this, according to the publicly available BIS banking data, that's the Bureau of International Settlements banking data, as of Q3 of 2021, international activity reported banks in China, which include a small portion of the non-Chinese banks with affiliates in China, have cross-border liabilities amounting to 1,563 billion, so 1.5 trillion or whatever, which is billion, of which 586 billion or 37% is dollar denominated. You hear that? Like, again, let me read that one more time so you guys get it. According to the publicly available BIS banking data, as of Q3 of 2021, international activity reporting banks in China, which include a small portion of non-Chinese banks with affiliates in China, have cross-border liabilities amounting to $1.5 trillion, of which 586 billion or 37% of it is dollar denominated. However, these same banks have 1 trillion, they have it in thousands, 1,057 billion in cross-border dollar-denominated assets, implying a large dollar funding gap. The BIS data cover total cross-border assets and liabilities in a given currency without a sub-breakdown for maturity. According to the public BIS data, the on-balance sheet dollar funding gap of 471 billion represent about 20% of China's total external debt. Right? So I know there was a lot there and it's kind of confusing on what it is saying, but ultimately it is breaking down and saying that these banks out there have issued out a lot of debt, and of that debt that they have issued out, a significant portion of it is done in dollars. That's what it's basically saying right there. I'm going to try and keep this video as short as possible, but I want to leave these links down in there and just give you guys the opportunity to go and take a look at some of this stuff, because it is very critical to understanding how it is that the dollar is playing a role in the international monetary system, and how these BRICS nations, even though they are setting up to try and compete against the dollar, they do not even come close. In fact, all these nations are suffering with the idea that they are probably going to come into a position in which that they are going to face dollar funding stresses. And the Federal Reserve is trying to figure out a way that they can keep the flow of liquidity going to these entities out there who have issued out this dollar-denominated debt, in order to keep the dollar from just skyrocketing in basically demand, as the need for dollars to pay these debts off is going to become very prevalent going into a downturning economy. Like, if you have a hard time accessing the dollars and all of a sudden these debts are coming due and you can't pay them off, this debt defaulting could actually become a very contagious event moving into other corporations and other nations out there. So being able to provide funding for these dollar-denominated debts during times of stress is very critical, and the Federal Reserve knows that they have to do this. Goes on to say this: with dollar financing, this is coming out of the Federal Reserve, the international role of the U.S. dollar post-COVID edition. This was given June 23rd of 2023. Now, let me see if I can find this again, because with dollar, is this the one? Okay. With dollar financing, in particular, high demand during times of crisis, foreign financial institutions may face difficulties in obtaining dollar funding. In response, the Federal Reserve has introduced 2 programs to ease crisis-induced strains in international dollar funding markets, thus mitigating the effects of strains on the supply of credit to domestic and foreign firms and households. To ensure that the dollar financing remained available in 2008 through 2009 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve introduced temporary swap lines with several foreign central banks, a subset of which were made permanent in 2013. During the COVID-19 crisis in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve increased the frequency of operations of the standing swap lines and introduced temporary swap lines with additional counterparties. The Federal Reserve also introduced the repo facility available to foreign and international monetary authorities, FEMA, with accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was made permanent in 2021. The frequency of swap lines operations was temporarily increased again in March and April of 2023 to relieve market stresses associated with the intervention in the operations of Credit Suisse and Swiss authorities. All right. So I know there was a lot again said inside of that, but ultimately they had figured out a way to be able to provide dollars to these foreign entities through these swap lines. And again, he goes on to say this, through the swap lines, and then again through the repo facility, setting up foreign entities to be able to use that repo facility. Both the swap lines and the FEMA repo facility have enhanced the standing of dollars as a dominant global currency, as approved users know that in a crisis they have access to a stable source of dollar funding. That is imperative. That is imperative to understand and know that they have funding sources. That these people who have taken out these debts, who have issued out dollar-denominated debts, know that if there was a time of stress, that they would have access to liquidity. And this is what the Federal Reserve has set up and made sure that they have access to this dollar funding liquidities during these times of stress. Does this sound like they're getting out of dollars? No, it sounds like they're trying to set up in a way that they can provide the liquidity, the funding to these nations, to these corporations during times of stress. And now I think about it, I'm going to try and end this video right now because this can go much deeper, and I just wanted to share these couple of links with you. But then I also wanted to share one more idea, and that is the credible threat theory that goes into this. Because not only is there definitely dollar-denominated debt that is running rampant throughout the entire global community out there, whether it's the BRICS nations and their sovereign debt issues that they are setting up that is due in dollars, or if it's just transactions that are needed to take place using the dollar system, being able to have access to the dollars is the critical point of what it is that the Federal Reserve is attempting to do, the demand for their liabilities. Now, when we think about the demand for their liabilities and how difficult it is for the Federal Reserve to actually get those liabilities out there to the world, that is, get that dollar out there for the people to use. Because the Federal Reserve is sitting in a position that makes it very difficult to constantly providing this funding out there. They are literally forcing the government into an unsustainable debt path, and they know that they cannot continue down this road. However, they have set up these facilities in order to deal with the times of crisis. But if you think about it from the credible threat theory, if they could put a narrative out there that says, hey, get out of the dollar, don't use the dollar, dollar is bad, don't, all the BRICS nations abandon the dollar. Well, this idea that people have about the BRICS nations and their feeling about the abandonment of the dollar then allows for the dollar to then be more prevalent within the markets as people are literally trying to get out of it. You see, here the Federal Reserve is trying to figure out a way that they could provide funding during times of stress, and yet here all these people out there who essentially hoard dollars are put into their head, dollars are bad, get out of dollars. They take the dollars away from the mattress and put it out there into the markets. Now the dollar funding is available, literally because the people are trying to get out of it itself. You see what's happening here? This is stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else. Nobody do I find out there talks about the Chinese dollar-denominated debt. Very rarely do you hear about how Brazil has issued out dollar-denominated debt. Very rarely do anybody really explain how much dollar-denominated debt truly exists out there in the world and how much demand for it can occur during times of stress when the debts come due. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. We'll discuss this further. Uneducated economist, you let me know.